Did you know that visualizing success, jumping in a cold river, and consuming illegal narcotics can trigger the release of the same pleasurable neurochemical in your brain? I know, it sounds like a late-night infomercial from the 90s, but it's true, it's science. And this little feel-good chemical is called dopamine. Dopamine is a well-known but often misunderstood neurotransmitter that plays a vital role in our experience of rewards, motivation, and cravings. If you have any interest in psychology and personal development, you've probably heard of it. But unfortunately, the internet is rife with popular myths about the nature of dopamine, dopamine levels, and how all of this impacts our sense of pleasure, focus, and drive. Now, broadly speaking, there are two types of dopamine levels to be aware of, and that's what we're going to get into this time on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. So if you're new here, hit that thumbs up, get subscribed, and if you're not new here, hit that thumbs up anyway. I promise it will help you trigger both of those levels of dopamine. Actually, I better not make that promise because we don't have the budget for the brain scans. But nonetheless, it'll make me feel good. Thank you so much for being here. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmerrymethod.com. Now, those two dopamine levels are tonic and phasic. And the tonic dopamine levels are basically the baseline levels of dopaminergic activity that occur in our brain. Definitely my brain. And if these levels are too amped up, you get things like impulsivity, hyperactivity, and mania, amongst other symptoms. If they are too low, this may lead to a loss of pleasure, depression, and symptoms of fatigue. Phasic dopamine levels are the moment-to-moment fluctuations in dopamine that we experience in response to specific stimuli, such as food, media, cigarettes, and alcohol. If phasic dopamine levels are too high, particularly for a prolonged period of time, this might lead to addiction and associated risky behaviors. If they're too low, this may reduce our ability to experience pleasure. However, it's important to note that our dopamine systems are impacted by the environment, genetics, and specific circumstances, and their relationship to behavior is very complex. Now, there may be a correlation between loss of motivation or low mood and low dopamine levels, but this doesn't mean that feeling low or unmotivated is only a result of dopamine dysfunction. So, what does it really mean when we say we want to reset our dopamine levels? Well, this would be to return to our baseline tonic dopamine levels and have them at a normal range. And there are generally 3 ways that you can do this that we'll discuss later on in this video, and I'll offer you some specific examples. But you basically want to reduce or eliminate the factors that cause dopamine dysregulation and then adopt healthy habits that support dopamine and other neurotransmitters so that they get into balance. And this can increase your tolerance and capacity to experience pleasure. But before we go any further, it's necessary to consider why some people may have low dopamine levels or low motivation and mood more generally. The first reason can be chronic stress. Releasing dopamine can often be a way that we deal with the stress of the present moment. It helps us disengage and go on autopilot, distract ourselves or ignore discomfort, and then disconnect and basically just wind up numb. When we're stressed, our brain releases a hormone called cortisol. And unfortunately, chronic stress leads to persistently elevated cortisol levels, and this can disrupt our dopamine balance and contribute to reduced motivation, pleasure, and general cognitive function. Stress can also mess with your memory. And reducing your stress may therefore increase your baseline levels of dopamine and increase your dopamine receptor sensitivity, and in doing so, reduce the urge to reach for quick dopamine spikes. The other reason is trauma. And when we talk about dopamine detoxing, most of the attention is focused on daily habits, such as social media, Netflix, overconsumption of food, nicotine, other substances. However, we often overlook the root causes of our reaching for those distractions in the first place. Now, while part of this behavior may be linked to societal abundance and increased access to dopamine spiking stimuli, this whole system is partly fueled and maintained by the very common experience of trauma. And trauma is basically any intense physiological or psychological stressor that the nervous system cannot process in the moment, and which results in a defense mechanism that limits our range of future responses to a situation. And the result of this trauma can range from simple disconnection and disengagement in life all the way to a formal diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Traumatic experiences, particularly during crucial periods of brain development, have long-lasting impacts on the brain's neurochemistry. That's not to mention trauma from brain injury, which can also cause issues. While we're still learning about the brain, it's entirely possible, maybe even probable, that dopamine hits give us relief from painful emotions, and therefore trauma makes us more susceptible to craving and addiction. For example, trauma can impact the functioning of dopamine-related brain regions such as the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, and disrupts dopamine receptors and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, HPA, which helps regulate stress hormones like cortisol. Now, fortunately, by receiving therapy to heal our trauma, we can move towards a state of nervous system regulation and control. I've had to go through it, so if you're sitting on the fence and you need help in that area, please make sure that you move forward. Sometimes it can take longer than it seems for those therapeutic interventions to switch on, but you can't have it switch on at all if you don't address those issues. So please do. And if you want to read my story about it, it's in a book called The Victorious Mind. And I'm so glad I kept moving forward, because it wasn't the first time, it wasn't the second time, it wasn't the third time necessarily that helped me, but it was all those times, because there was a compounding effect. And it's really, really important to stop stopping and quit quitting and keep moving forward, because you can be healed. Now, another reason we have issues here is basically abuse of the dopamine. We engage in pleasure-seeking activities such as excessive screen time on the internet or TV, consuming unhealthy or processed foods, and we get rewarded with brief surges in dopamine without any effort or very minimal effort. And the problem with instant gratification, as opposed to delayed gratification, is that the brain was evolutionarily designed to provide good feelings in response to effort. This means that over time, our dopamine receptors become desensitized, and we are dependent on more and more intense forms of pleasure seeking. The extreme end of this occurs in substance abuse such as amphetamines or cocaine, whereby the result is chronically low dopamine levels, where you get depression, decreased motivation, and cognitive dysfunction. However, overindulging in something like YouTube, Netflix, or social media can do the same thing. Maybe it's on a smaller scale, but it's related. In psychology, there's something called the opponent process theory. This is the general heuristic that is used to describe how the brain seeks to find balance. And in the case of pleasure and pain, if we only seek pleasure, we eventually experience pain. Whereas if we intentionally seek out discomfort, we will be rewarded with pleasure, such as in the case of intense exercise and endorphin release, but it's also when it comes to memory techniques, such as language learning. I'm always telling you, please make sure to take on challenges. Lean into those challenges, because if you keep rushing away from the challenges, you're going to cripple yourself. But the challenges themselves are not only going to be rewarding, but they're going to lead to greater rewards. So all of this is known as hormesis, which is exposing ourselves to mild stressors to improve resilience and well-being in the long term. Then you have, obvious stuff, but often common sense isn't so common. So we're talking about sleep, diet, exercise. A lot of people have a generally unhealthy lifestyle. Insufficient quality of sleep gets in the way of the brain's ability to reset your dopamine levels. It damages your concentration. It ruins your motivation and mood regulation. And similarly, if we don't get the essential nutrients we need, such as amino acids, vitamins, minerals, our brain cannot be optimized for dopamine production. And then, of course, exercise is important for the overall health of your brain, as well as its efforts to help with dopamine release. So having a sedentary lifestyle can contribute to low levels of dopamine. Not good. And then the final factor is genetics. And there's a complex relationship between dopamine production, the enzymes involved in dopamine synthesis, dopamine receptor sensitivity, and the efficiency of transporters. It's beyond me and beyond the scope of this video, but it's important to know that there's currently no test that I'm aware of that can accurately tell you if you are genetically predisposed to low tonic dopamine levels. The takeaway here is that you can change how you feel, and I'm about to share how. So one thing that is trending is the idea of dopamine fasting. And I've talked about this in the sense of technological fasting or digital fasting. And there's been a lot of people who have different views about this. Strangely, some of those people who think that digital fasting isn't a thing happen to have an app to sell you. I'm not going to name any names or point any fingers, but the relationship between dopamine and behavior is still relatively misunderstood. So my choice to do digital fasting is not necessarily based on the science. It's based on common sense, though. I mean, I really want to protect my brain from too much digital exposure. So I go out for long walks with only books, leave the cell phone at home. Sometimes I bring it, especially if I'm going to be separated from my wife. That's just good thinking, you know, for safety and all that sort of stuff. But as much as possible, I try to reduce my exposure to not just the digital media, but the impulse to check the digital media, which leads to these little spikes. But again, it's all sort of controversial. You do you, and I would just encourage you to think it through and see how it works out in your own life. According to Dr. Anna Lembke, psychiatrist and author of Dopamine Nation, and neuroscientist Andrew Huberman, in the case of those with chronic dopamine imbalances such as recovering addicts, a dopamine fast whereby we intentionally abstain from things that trigger our phasic dopamine levels while our tonic dopamine levels get back towards normal can be helpful. For those with a history of substance abuse, this is best discussed with a psychiatrist before attempting any form of detox, which can be quite challenging and emotionally disruptive. And again, myself, I definitely think I have a digital addiction. So that's part of the reason why I have chosen to do as much digital fasting as possible. The point is, you want to avoid easy street. And for most of us, Huberman suggests that it's more effective to actively reduce but not completely eliminate the things that give us pleasure too easily. So, for example, I noticed about a year ago that I had picked up a couple of small but noticeable immediate gamification habits, especially during the lockdowns in 2021, 2022, etc. And whenever I ate a meal by myself, I would be consuming content, usually an educational podcast or a YouTube video, and my wife and I we would watch Fool Us with Penn and Teller, and it was really easy to justify this as productivity because I study magic, I've been a magician for many years, but the reality is that it was entertainment, but also entertainment that blocked me from paying attention to chewing my food, and that's just not good. So a kind of 21st century abstinence came into play, especially when my wife got bored of Fool Us and started watching her own stuff. So we have two cell phones on the table playing different videos and so forth, and it really falls under something that I think Huberman refers to as dopamine stacking. So we're sitting there drawing from multiple sources of pleasure at once, and we're both in our own little worlds. So we're eating food, we've got our digital media, we both have either teas or coffee that have some caffeine, and listening to music is part of the experience of a lot of these shows, and we're just getting so much stimulation at the same time. So what I needed to do is basically be a bit draconian and say, nobody watches videos at the dinner table. And initially there was some resistance, and it was very, very hard. But after a few weeks, I noticed that I was enjoying eating more, and I was just being much more focused, and we would have more conversations about more things. So one thing you might want to consider is to abstain from what you habitually reach for when you're in distress or when you're just on autopilot, and learn to tolerate the distress and the discomfort, and then go one step further and actively seek out challenges. So one thing I like to do fairly often is neurobics, which is like eating with your non-dominant hand, or using chopsticks with a hand that you need to actually learn how to do that complicated activity. And it's really, really powerful for rewiring the brain and bringing an extra level of concentration where you can mitigate some of that, I really would like to have a video playing or having music on or whatever it is. And so basically what I'm saying is that digital fasting is probably not going to have like super extreme effects, and the stress of having too much digital fasting might actually counteract the subtle positive effects that you're looking for. but it's well worth exploring in your context. I've found huge benefits. Another thing I want to suggest here is to do your own due diligence, do your own research, look into the origin of the idea of dopamine fasting. From what I've discovered, this comes from a psychiatrist, Dr. Cameron Sepa, and he actually says that his initial focus was not neurochemical. I mean, think about it. You can't really fast from a naturally occurring chemical. How do you dopamine fast when it's just going on in your brain all the time, right? It's not really fasting. What he was after was a cognitive behavioral therapy method intended to help people reduce impulsive behavior. So digital fasting, dopamine fasting, needs to be looked at in that context, and it really helps to know your history. So with all these factors in mind, let's think about how that we can go beyond just maintaining a healthy diet, getting regular exercise, having sufficient sleep, and reducing your overall stress levels. We all know that sort of stuff. I mean, common sense is not that common, but what else can you do? Well, think of it in terms of exercises and stacking these exercises together as a kind of habit stack. There are several forms of meditation, and there's one in particular that is most likely to improve your baseline dopamine levels and general brain health. It's ultimately a practice that makes you feel good, and you're going to then wind up being motivated to do it more consistently. And this is really, really important. It's going to be different for different people. So if you don't feel that you're having this effect, then you want to explore different kinds of meditation. But focused attention meditation is a great way to stimulate high levels of dopamine release. The main problem is that some people are going to find it difficult to concentrate for long enough to get the benefits. So let's work on that. One way to do that is loving kindness meditation. And this can be deeply healing and great for fostering feelings of love, safety, and connectedness. And it has a visualization part that can be challenging if you can't visualize, but you can also just think conceptually about people and project compassion just at your idea of them at will. So some people have aphantasia, they can't see images in their minds, etc. And when I was going through an aphantasia period, I would just run through the alphabet to do loving kindness meditation. And I'd literally start with the letter A and think, okay, so I remember my friend Adam from school, and just send him good vibes. Then go to my friend Brad, and all these people up till the letter Z. Now, you might be thinking, but I don't know somebody for every letter of the alphabet. It's fine to skip those people. The point is that the alphabet provides a kind of structure, a roller coaster or a train track, if you will, where you don't have to concentrate so hard because you have a pattern to follow. And so just go through these different people. Another approach is chanting or singing as a form of meditation. It's an amazing way to stimulate the vagus nerve. It reduces physiological stress, and it will release dopamine. You might be too shy to chant out loud. Well, I don't necessarily have tips for doing that, but listen, I walk around and I see people talking to themselves. They've got earbuds in, they're having conversations. Nobody's going to pay attention to you if you learn a mantra in Sanskrit and go Chittameva Mahadosham, Chittameva Hi Balakaha, Chittameva Mahatmayam, Chittameva Mahanasat while you're walking around. I do it all the time. Nobody is paying attention to me. And I sing different mantras. Mano Bujahankara Chitanina. No one is paying any attention. It doesn't really matter. And it's so good. I feel better right now. I wasn't feeling particularly bad, but boom, it's so good. So there's multiple ways to crack the meditation code. It is a huge benefit. Please get into it. And if you need help figuring out yet more meditation approaches, check out my book, The Victorious Mind. Now, when it comes to cold exposure, you've probably heard a lot about this. And it comes back to that theme of hormesis, progressively introducing yourself to uncomfortable situations. It is a very, very potent way to reset your dopamine levels by getting some cold exposure. Now, this is commonly done with ice baths, swimming in cold water, or taking cold showers. And cold exposure stimulates the production of norepinephrine, which is a precursor to dopamine. And one study found that immersion in cold water raised blood levels of dopamine by 250%, and this was still elevated for up to 72 hours after the cold exposure. On top of this, there are many other health benefits to cold exposure, such as a reduction in stress levels, improved blood circulation, improved focus and energy, and better sleep, which may indirectly help balancing out your dopamine levels. Now, another thing really important, I've enjoyed it a lot over the years, is viewing early morning sunlight. And then the opposite end is avoiding screen time at night. So human beings spent 99% of our history without electronic lights. And as a result, our physiology is highly attuned to natural light, which is influential in regulating our dopamine production. Viewing early morning sunlight without sunglasses for 10 to 30 minutes a day can help release dopamine when you do it consistently. It goes without saying, you don't want to stare directly at the sun. Then take the flip side. Viewing the bright artificial lights between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. has been shown to significantly reduce the amount of dopamine in our system. And this is worrying, given that a large majority of the world's population are watching screens late into the night. So, I have a digital curfew most evenings. Sometimes I break the rules, but usually it is books only after 6 p.m. or so. And I read, and my wife sometimes calls me the 3-minute snoringer, but I usually read much longer than that. But nonetheless, it's a great way to fall asleep. I love it. And physical books on my lap, reading. So it's just beautiful. And other nights, it's also just putting the books away, turning the light off, and then doing my little singing of mantras just in my mind silently so that I don't keep my wife up. Now, here's another thing that I find a little bit hard to do, but I do it. And that is reducing down to doing one thing at a time. When we're stacking several sources of dopamine at a time, we're going to overspike our phasic dopamine levels and lead to a crash and reduced motivation in the long term. You probably have been in this situation where you've got 50 tabs open on your browser and you're not actually dealing with any of them. You're just constantly flipping between them. That is going to overload your dopamine. If you really want to be able to focus, you gotta break things down. Open up just one browser with one tab, get that task done, move on to the next one. The only time I think that multitasking is really a thing to lean into is in memory training itself. So when I do name demonstrations, I am literally multitasking because I'm thinking about the imagery that I'm using for the people as their names come in while I'm thinking about the names that I just memorized to help extend their passage from short-term memory or working memory into long-term memory. And then, also adding on details that they're saying in small talk. It's just managing a whole lot. Other things are like singing while you're playing guitar. That's a kind of multitasking, so to speak. Sometimes I like to do my mantra chants while I'm juggling. That's a kind of multitasking. So it has a place, but it just doesn't have a place when you're trying to get stuff done, especially when you have limited hours of the day before you need to put that digital curfew in place so that you can sleep better. Now, another exercise is to work on controlling your thoughts. It's quite clear that when we have negative thoughts, our nervous system takes this as a stressor and it reduces our capacity for pleasure. This is something I've had to deal with because I seem to be genetically predisposed to having negative thoughts. However, what a lot of people don't know is that by intentionally having positive thoughts or using positive mental imagery, we can actually release dopamine. This is one reason why I love using memory palaces to memorize positive material. It combines goal-oriented, focused attention with positive mental imagery and positive mental content that improves the dopamine levels in my brain. And I haven't had the brain scan or the blood tests to prove it, but someone just recently was telling me, I saw this old video with you and you weren't nearly as inspiring as you are now. And I said, yeah, the reason why I leave those old videos is because it's a proof of concept. The more that I have worked on precisely what I preach, practiced these things that I say, the more you can see it. The light just starts to switch on and beams. So I like to leave those old videos, even if they're not necessarily going to be the best first impression. Well, it's definitely proof of concept. Now, ultimately, it's so important to maintain your dopamine balance and to maintain the activities that ensure that you get enough of all the feel-good chemicals in your brain, the endorphins, the serotonin, the oxytocin. This is going to ensure that you feel more fulfilled and motivated in general, and that you don't have as many cravings to reach for dopamine hits. So you got to make the necessary effort to balance your dopamine levels when there are so many easy sources of neurochemical reward available at our fingertips 24/7. This can be hard. But like most healthy habits, the best route to long-term success is to start with small steps. And also, I would suggest having a bird's eye overview of what all those small steps look like, so you can chart out a path and really get into play what needs to get into play in one fell swoop, so to speak, over a period of time with consistency. So that can sound like a lot, but if you gotta start with improving your diet, start where you are, then add exercise, then add meditation. But choose a starting point and try to do it in such a way that you can stack things together. Find an exercise routine that you like doing. Eat healthy foods that you prefer. That's not overwhelm. You can do that in a single day. Experiment with different meditation styles and find one that you enjoy, but don't dismiss the potential of leaning into ones that challenge you. I wasted so much time dismissing things that not only challenged me, but I found a little bit offensive. This is something that I talked about in my TEDx talk, and I was such a fool, to dismiss perfectly valid experiments just because of a personal bias. Now, I'm forgiving to myself because I know now a lot about how the brain biases us, and memory itself biases as a bias. What is that word? It creates a bias in ourselves against common sense. So, hug to the bad me, but you can break out of it, and you just got to get started somewhere. And I love that I did take small steps, but I stacked them together. So it was multiple small steps instead of like waiting 5 months of better diet to get into fitness, just starting to eat better and going to the gym, getting a personal trainer, and at the same time doubling down on meditation and starting to explore other meditation techniques and cold therapy all at the same time. And again, I've talked about this in The Victorious Mind if you want to see how that all worked out. It's a little bit overkill in my sense, but I hope you don't have to wait to hit rock bottom like I did. In any case, if you're concerned that you may have chronically low levels of dopamine as a result of substance abuse, or you've experienced a prolonged period of low mood, please make sure that you contact a properly qualified therapist in your area. And one person who's been on the podcast who I highly recommend that you speak with, who is completely qualified to deal with all this stuff, is Ben Fishel. He, in fact, helped me. He's the guy who I talk about in my TEDx talk and I talk about in The Victorious Mind, who prompted all of many, many adventures that I've had with really exploring how to get my own dopamine levels sorted. Well, I just highly, highly recommend him. He does global telehealth consulting, and if you're in the Melbourne area, then even better. In any case, I hope that this deep dive into science is a thing that never ends, but let's just call it the truth as such of what dopamine resetting is all about has really enlightened you to the topic and will be of great use to you. Pass it on if you know people who are struggling, and just get into memory training, because the ultimate argument for the memory component of it is that it's all too easy to forget our commitments. It's all too easy to forget what to do and how to do it. But if there's one step that really has every other step nested in it, it is memory. And better memory helps you remember all the other steps, because there is nuance, there is detail, and those granular little details have so many riches in them, they almost feel like a dopamine spike unto themselves. And a good one, one that you can repeat again and again and again and enjoy.